I welcome you to Partners for Law in Development's archiving series, Ways of Seeing and Being, that spotlights movements and practices that are defining of feminist visions of law and justice. This episode looks at the feminist mobilizing and cross-national solidarities on the comfort women issue through the mid-1990s across East and Southeast Asia to hold Japan accountable for sexual slavery and rape during the World War II. At a time when rape was viewed as collateral damage instead of a crime in international law, the Comfort Women movement in Asia, together with the feminist efforts at the International War Crimes Tribunal for former Yugoslavia in 1993 and International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in 1994, changed the law definitively. Rape and sexual slavery came to be recognized as weapons of war amounting to war crimes. Yet, the mobilizing of comfort women was not animated purely by the need for law reform. At the heart of the extensive regional solidarities was the painstaking effort to identify comfort women, create a community for and with them, to break silences and begin processes of individual and collective healing. Of the many feminists whose unstinting efforts shaped this movement is Indai Sajor, our guest in this episode. She is in conversation with Miho Tsujii. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the two of them, both part of the Comfort Women movement. Indai Sajor has worked over 30 years in contexts of war and conflict in Asia Pacific, Africa, and the Middle East, on issues of women, peace, and security through the UN and international organizations. Her work as the convener of the Women's International War Crimes Tribunal on Japan's military sexual slavery marked the beginning of her very important journey in the field of women, peace, and security, in which she continues to work to this day. Miho Tsujii is a performance artist, creative director, producer, and educator. Miho's work strives for regeneration of life in moments of destructions, creating a seamless line between her art and social intervention. Her stories draw on her own experiences relating to generational impacts of war, nuclear disaster, as well as gender and cultural hybridity. Her work, she has worked with women survivors of conflicts around the world, particularly comfort women, and was associated with Women's Caucus for Gender Justice during the establishment of the International Criminal Court. Over to you, Miho and Indai, to begin the conversation.
Thank you, Madhu. Indai, so 50 years of silence after the World War II. And in 1991, Korean survivor Kim Hak-soon broke the silence to testify the crimes of sexual slavery that the Japanese military has committed. You have led the Comfort Women movement. I've walked with you. I've witnessed your strides in Japan and international work. It's been 20 years, and today we are walking through the movement once again. So let me start with the question of how the movement started and your encounter with the Korean activists and how you started your movement in the Philippines, taking down your first testimony and the road ahead.
Miho, 90, 91, were 92, leading to 93, were great years for the women's movement, because it was the year that we all started to talk about the different issues our countries were facing. You know, in Asia, the issue of sex trafficking of women, mail order bride, and the issue of domestic violence and how to handle domestic violence was really in the national stage. So and not to mention the feminization of poverty. So all of these issues were very interrelated. During that period, I was working with Asian Center for Women's Human Rights, AWHRC, and we were already looking at the issue of sex trafficking of women, which was very rampant in the Philippines and also in other countries. So there was a natural solidarity that linked me to Yayoi Matsui and other friends in Korea, in Thailand, and also in Malaysia. All of us started talking about women from Southeast Asia being brought to first world countries as part of sex trafficking. And within that natural linkages, because of the cause, we started to form our own networks. And by 1991, when Kim Hak-sung came out to tell her story about being a comfort woman during the Second World War, I just happened to be in Seoul, Korea, attending a conference on sex trafficking. And so it was really an opening for us to understand that, wow, this was another element of sex trafficking, except it happened during the Second World War. And we were really coping to understand from her testimony, how did it happen? So that propelled us to dig deeper into the issue. We said maybe the best way is to go over the radio in the Philippines and ask if there were women who were raped during the Second World War to please contact us. And we gave Liddy's telephone number and address in our office. We just said that if any of those who are listening to us, I remember those words, we are here, we are looking for any women who have been raped during the Second World War, because we would like to document your stories. It was just the level of documentation during that time. We were not yet talking about justice and compensation. That was not yet in our agenda. We were just thinking, okay, let's document this women's human rights violation. So that was when Lola Rosa Henson in the Philippines came out. And because she was the first Filipino comfort women to come out, the media, really, the media in the Philippines just really, took her case immediately. So during the press conference, we never expected it. We were expecting just 2 or 3 TV companies, but all the Japanese TV companies came to our press conference in Manila, and all the TV, and so it became a national issue. Rosa Henson became a front page in all the newspapers in the Philippines as well as in Japan. And then we started going into the television. And she was interviewed a lot, and that is where the story impacted other women who listened to her on the radio and on television, and they also started to come out and tell their story. As the issue of the comfort women in the Philippines started to come out, and all these women speaking over the radio, over the television, it was really a mass movement of information. Women who were raped during that period actually started to come out as well. And this was the time when I was able to uncover the mass rape of Mapanike, which was also brought to the Women's International War Crimes Tribunal. So that catapulted a lot of issues at different levels, I would say, during that period. And the coming out of the comfort women was on a different level, because they were all women in their advanced age, in their 70s, in their 80s, and they were unquestionable. You cannot have a grandmother lying, they just had nothing to lose but tell the truth. I think the importance in handling women who have speak out is that we activists and advocates and as feminists, we have to give them the floor. You know what I mean? They are the main frame of the issue. And so even with us, I remembered with Yayori and Yoon Jong-uk and all of those activists, every time we are with the comfort women and we are speaking in front of 100 or 1,000 people or so, they were the main speaker and we were in the background either translating or if not, we had other translators to work with them. So the center stage was always them. Yeah. And even in the press conference, we were only translators and repeating what they said and expounding of it, of course. But the point is the center stage was them. And I think that was one, I would say, a feminist framework that was very important. And then during that time, because I was saying the global movement was already, moving in that direction. So the women from former Yugoslavia and Rwanda and other countries who started to speak out also took center stage. So that was a unique time when the survivors themselves came out to tell the horrendous violence that they have gone through. And people had no choice but to really not only sympathize, but to really support them in this struggle. Now, in relation to the strength of the movement itself, it became natural for all of us Asian women working on the issue to really question how this happened. Why are there so many women all of a sudden coming out to tell their story? Then you understand, and we begin to understand the nature of the silencing of women. We were able to connect that to some of the few testimonies of women who were sex trafficked. We were able to connect that to the women who actually were victims of domestic violence, that even them would not come out to tell what happened to them inside their homes because of fear, because of shame, and because there was no mechanism to help and support them and to really save their lives technically. So within that context, we started to learn. It was a learning process for us. We didn't know what we were doing. We were basically trying to learn from one another. And that is where the Asian Network of Women and the movement of it came together. And I think one of the most important factor of that is uniting to understand how we can address the issue, looking at what are the mechanisms we can set up to support women who were either victims of sex trafficking or domestic violence or other forms of violence done to women in any context for that matter, because during that time there were a number of conflicts happening in Cambodia, in many other countries. So that process pushed us to unite and start setting up network naturally. There was no, it was just a conscious effort. It was very natural for us to set up the network. So Yayori and our Japanese colleagues who knew of this issue as well and who were really persistent in us linking together, catapulted a whole movement on the comfort women issue. Actually, I have to say that it was the role of the Japanese women feminists that pushed us to say, come to Japan, bring this issue to Japan. Without them, we would have never done that. We would have just stayed in our countries and, demand our government. But what they really did and encouraged us is say, no, this is a crime committed by our government 50 years ago. Come to Japan and let the women speak their story. So I think when you look at it, that was the impact of the work that we have done. And I would really say it was because of solidarity. It was because of the unity towards the issue, and hence a movement was really developed. By 1993, we have the World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna. And that was the only time that the United Nations recognized women's human rights as a human rights issue. That was the only time that the United Nations recognized violence against women as a crime against person, so, and of course, the development of the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. But also the United Nations recognized that all past crimes committed against women should continue to be prosecuted. So there were a lot of milestones that we did during that period leading to the Beijing conference in 1995. So the movement, what we had in Asia, was also developing in Africa, in Latin America, and in North America, because the women have also come out to tell their own stories of violence and rape. So I think that unity pulled us together. And as I remember, 1991-92 was also the war in former Yugoslavia and the genocide in Rwanda. So all of this confluence of global events that talk about women, how they have been massacred and raped and killed randomly, systematically, and widespread at the same time, really made a difference in the movement itself. It strengthened the movement. We started talking about accountability. But I would just like to say in this is that the movement made all the difference. Without a movement, we are unable to push. But because there's a movement, we were able to push the governments and the United Nations to recognize these issues. When Kim Hak-sum came out and told her story, it should be also recognized that the Korean activists, our sisters and brothers in Korea, started to pick at the Japanese embassy in Seoul in 1992. And now till today, I would say for the past 28 years, Koreans, both young and old, have gathered in front of the Japanese embassy in central Seoul every Wednesday, making it the world's longest running protest. And I would say the soul of this activism is a legacy that should be handed down from generation to generation, to acknowledge not only the right to justice, but more importantly, to pass on to the next generation that this crime should not be repeated again throughout the world. So the symbol of the picket that is still happening today, every Wednesday in Seoul, Korea, is not just for the comfort women anymore. It's also to send a message globally and around the world to stop sexual violence in war or in armed conflict.
I've seen the evolution of survivors through dialogue with you and other activists. Also, I've seen the survivors also drive the activists. For example, Kan Dok-kyun, a Korean Halmoni, a comfort woman survivor, she painted this painting called Punish the Perpetrator. And that painting said that we need criminal prosecution, which the movement was not ready yet, but eventually the movement caught on and responded and held the tribunal, Women's International War Crimes Tribunal. So it was a real kind of relationship building as well. Being in Japan and being involved with you, Indai, we have learned a lot from your advocacy. I mean, Filipino women, you were activist pros, you had done the martial law, you had marched against the Marcos, Filipino women who brought the comfort woman case to Japan to me became my mentors and aunts. We learned a lot from your advocacy strategies and, campaigns. But not only that, I was supporting the Filipino comfort woman court case that the victims have filed. And it wasn't just about, campaign. It was really strides together, walking step by step. And I remember the day I met you, I think. That was when the Tokyo District Court judgment was delivered. It wasn't a judgment. The court declined the filing of the case. And I remember going to the press conference straight after. And all the Lolas, we call the Filipina grandmother Lolas. So Filipina survivors, we call them by this endearment term, Lola. All the Lolas were on the podium, and each, plaintiff, the Lola, spoke. And at the very end of the table was this very small woman, and she was frowning the whole time. And when the mic was in, she was less vocal than other Lolas. And when the mic was given to her, she said, "I'm ashamed. This is my first day of ever meeting any comfort women survivors in life." And I was a college student. And she said, "I'm ashamed. I can't go back to a village like this. And if this is the way it goes, I can't go back to the village." And that was Tomasa Dioso Salinog, her endearment term, Lola Masing. And at that moment, I thought, the shame is on us, And so she came out to, I think she was the second woman to come out in the Philippines after Rosa. And she broke out to seek justice for, the crimes committed against her. One day, two Japanese soldiers came to her house, and she was living alone with her father because her mother had died after giving birth, and he loved her dearly. And the Japanese soldiers came and broke into the house, and the father tried to protect Lola Masing, and then the soldiers beheaded the father right in front of her eyes. And then after that, she was taken, she was abducted and sexually enslaved by Japanese military for 2 years till the end of the war. And after 50 years of silence, I think she came out to testify to you, Indai. And despite all the stigma in the village, the women become shamed by villagers for being victimized, like in every other sexual violence case. And she came out and did this justice struggles, all the while being called so many things in her village, just to seek justice for herself, but also for her father in her mind. That day, she was waiting to receive justice, but was rejected. That was when I first ever met comfort women survivors. And Lola Masing never married in life, because of all that's happened. She said, "I'm going to fight for justice."
Yeah. It's very important, Miho. I remember that you went down into the details of that famous day with Lola Masing. I would just like to add on to that, because I remembered one of the very touching thing with Attorney Yokota relationship with Lola Masing and Tsujii, and you, of course, was that when they asked Lola Masing how she heard about the comfort women, and she said she heard it on the radio. She has a small radio, and so she decided to come because we were in Iloilo City at that time, and so we said where we are in a hotel, and those who would like to come, please come. She had no money actually even to travel to Iloilo, and so she decided to sell her blanket to be able to ride in a bus to come to Iloilo. And that touch, I remember Attorney Yokota and Tsujii was so touched with that story that it just showed how, you know, how she was so real and so genuine to do all that just to be able to come out and tell her story. It was like an opportunity for her in a lifetime. She was always saying that I want to say it before I die, you know, and that was, you know, the one thing with Lola Masing. She took on the issue to her heart, and you know, and eventually I would just like to note that the province, you know, in her village, the province in her village have honored her by setting up a small museum, you know, in her honor at the city hall, you know, of Antique in Aklan.
So I've seen you walk through, you and the survivors walk through the path of pursuing justice through the Japanese court mechanism, which led nowhere. There were 9 court cases filed by different groups of Japanese women who were supporting the survivors from those different countries, as well as the activists like Indai, who were working to file the case, and also Japanese lawyers, you know, housewives, students, and priests, all, you know, all spectrum of people, different age and population joined, feminists, of course, to support these court cases. And also, you know, we hosted events where survivors speak, or, you know, activists from victimized countries like Indai would come and speak to garner public support and awareness, and to this truth building in Japan. So we did a lot of those activities, and eventually we did the tribunal, and slowly many survivors started to pass away. We have established the truth at the tribunal. We won many things, but the Japanese government kept on denying truth, and kept on denying legal responsibility. At the same time, the victims were passing away one by one. And when Tomasa Salinog, a Filipino comfort woman survivor, whom I was basically became a grandmother to me in our relationship. I would visit her, you know, take her around Japan. When she passed away, I really thought to myself, what can I do? This situation has not changed as far as the Japanese government goes. And then someone called me, this musical director called me. He wanted to organize a musical about Tomasa Salinog, a Filipino comfort woman survivor. And he wanted my help in organizing the musical. So I joined, and then I learned that there were 300 people from age 4 through 80, men, women, people, able, disabled, students, you know, all kinds of people joining the musical, and which presented a story of Tomasa Salinog, from her upbringing to the violence committed against her, and, you know, stigma that she faced. And that musical was about portraying a sense of dignity and justice. Now I came in to speak about the comfort women movement and Tomasa Salinog, and I thought, okay, how am I going to convey this very difficult, sensitive issue? But then when I started speaking, everyone was already there in their soul and their hearts, and they understood what justice meant for the survivors, because they were already there. My soul was invested in acting out. So I saw how quickly people can understand this issue, empathize with just the justice struggles, and try to reenact as their own experiences through the musical. And The musical was held in 3 different parts of Japan, 100 people participating in the musical in each city, and it got 60,000 people in total in Japan to see this musical, which is probably like a bigger number than activist events can actually draw. But yeah, so I realized that, of course, the Japanese government refused the truth, but Comfort Women survivors and we activists established truth. And I wanted to ensure that truth be ingrained, even if laws and government policy may deny or change overnight, truth can be kept inside people's hearts and minds. And in this way, I'm not going to let the stories of Comfort Women fade or die. So that's why I carried on to perform to tell the story of Comfort Women survivors, and also the story of my grandfather who went to war on the other side of the war as perpetrator, but also a soldier, also a victim with a PTSD he suffered all his life together, so that we don't forget all of the pains and all of the justice and all of the gains and empowerment and dignity which art can convey and bring into people's hearts.
I think each woman, as a feminist, I would really say this: each woman have our own sense of what constitutes justice for us. I remembered with the Comfort Women, there's the Korean Comfort Women, when they were taught to forgive, they will never forgive the Japanese military, that raped them. They were unforgiving. They said, no, they rape us. It is unforgivable. But for the Filipino Comfort Women, they were willing to forgive because the religion, the Catholic religion, told them to forgive those that have wronged them. So for them, forgiving was their own sense of justice. For the Korean Comfort Women, not forgiving was their own sense of justice. It was also taking back their lives. So, each woman have their own sense of justice. I remembered when I was talking to the Chinese Comfort Women, the first one who came out, and she said, if I have the opportunity, I would like to kill the men who raped me. So her sense of justice was to get back and kill them. So each one have her own sense of justice, and I think we should recognize that not all justice is within the legal framework. It is about finding your soul back. It is about, healing your own pain. It is about recognizing what this pain has contributed to the international community, how you were influence others to be courageous, how you influence others to rise up to their own pain. And I think that was what the Comfort Women really did, because they had to find themselves as well. I remembered when Lola Rosa came, the first time she told us our story, she came, her clothes was all dirty, and she was smoking and telling us her story, in a very sad way. She could hardly look at us in the eye. She was always bowing her head, and look us once in a while and bow her head. But because we need to get her story in full, she has to come back and tell again her story and then come back again. So we'd made schedule with her. But during this period, I really saw the transformation with her. She started to buy new clothes. She started to put on lipstick and powder, and she started looking at us directly. She started to talk with dignity and power and energy that was not there when the first time she came to testify and talk about her story. And that for me was already getting her life back, as they would say, I would like to get my soul back. So It was very important.
And along the way, the transformations manifested. And I think that's, one of the manifestations of that is the Women's International War Crimes Tribunal on Japan's military sexual slavery, which we will talk about later. But also, justice was something that women created along the way. It was not defined by any court or defined by the Japanese government or even international mechanism. They created and figured out every step of the way and then inspired the new definitions of what justice means to women. I want you to also talk about the international mobilization, especially through the UN mechanism and the global women's movement, which the Comfort Women movement has inspired, but which has also established a further strong, robust path towards justice on crimes against women under war and armed conflict.
So you have two wars ongoing, the war in Yugoslavia and the genocide in Rwanda in the early 90s. And that was exactly the same period that the Comfort Women came out. And so I wouldn't say the timeliness of it, but it really verified the stories of the Comfort Women. It verified the issue of rape and sexual slavery and torture and mutilation of the women that testified. But as I was saying, this was a period where the global events also connived with us, because by 1992, leading to the World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna in 1993, there was a preparatory meetings being held for the conference in Geneva. And during this time, Charlotte Vance, Roxana Carrillo, Florence Botegua, Asma Jahangir, Hina Jilani, Alda Fascio was there, Gladys Acosta was there, Maria Suarez from Nicaragua. I mean, we gathered together in Geneva. It was at that time UNIFEM who brought us there to lobby for the recognition of women's human rights in the United Nations preparatory meetings. So what we did was we brought the Korean Comfort Women themselves and the Filipino Comfort Women. We went to Geneva and we lobbied the Commission on Human Rights to pressure the Japanese government to recognize compensation and reparation for the Comfort Women. The national movement was developing through pickets and rallies and, talking to the media about the issue at the global level. We were already seated at the preparatory meetings in the United Nations, trying to change the language in the platform for action leading to Vienna. So it was a confluence of this event that brought us there. And so by the time we reached Vienna, and there was a lot of events in Vienna, including the Tribunal on Women, we were ready to bring the survivors, the victims, and other women leaders. So those events allowed us to come together with Lepam Lajenovic, who was leading the the group, coming from the former Yugoslavia, of women who just came out from rape and sexual slavery. And then you have women from Latin America. So that natural gathering of women by the hundreds became a key role to influence the normative framework that is being developed in Vienna on women's rights as human rights. So when we were in Vienna, for the first time, we set up a women's caucus that all the women activists at the World Conference gathered together. And I happened to chair the Women's Caucus at the World Conference on Women in Vienna. And we really made a difference during that period because it was just all women of all colors coming together and say, you have to recognize women's rights as human rights. And so it was also during that period, I remembered in 1993, that Radhika Kumaraswamy first became the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. And Radhika Kumaraswamy came out with a very strong report on the comfort women. Her report was separate from other reports that she did. She did a standalone report on the comfort women, and one of her recommendations was specifically to put Japan for its responsibility to give reparations to the comfort women. Then after Radhika, we also have the UN Special Rapporteur, which, by the way, we created on slavery and slavery-like practices, which was Gay McDougall. And so Gay McDougall also did a very strong report. She came to Japan and Korea and the Philippines and looked at and interviewed many of the comfort women, and her recommendations in her report, because by then the issue of sexual slavery has become a language in the United Nations, and that Japan has legal responsibility on the cases of the comfort women, and that, since the case of the comfort women was not heard at the International Military Tribunal of the Far East, known as the Tokyo Trial, then it is high time to recognize and acknowledge this crime committed against women. But during that period, I would also say that a special rapporteur on the right to compensation and reparation in wartime, Professor Theo van Woven from the Netherlands, also came out with a full report on the right to compensation and reparation of the comfort women. He made a strong report to the Japanese government, encouraging them to acknowledge, the right of the comfort women. So there were a lot of resolutions and recommendations coming from different rapporteurs, including the rapporteur on torture. He said that sexual slavery was torture, So a lot of this came out from the Commission on Human Rights, and that catapulted the issue of the comfort women to international level. And then we brought the case to CSW, which is known as the Commission on the Status of Women in New York. We also brought the comfort women there. They testified, and we gave recommendations and resolutions to the CSW on the cases of the comfort women, which by that time, because of the activism surrounding CSW, many women from different countries, and of course, the activists from the 10 countries, from Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia, Taiwan, East Timor, all of them came out to support the comfort women and the activists in other countries. But I think the one that was really also very well marked was we brought the report to CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. So in our CEDAW report, we did, shadow report to CEDAW to again put the legal accountability, under international law and humanitarian law on the case of the comfort women. So a lot of efforts were done during this time. It mobilized other human rights organizations as well to acknowledge this issue and to rally behind the cases of the comfort women.
And eventually also the ICC, the Statute of the International Criminal Court, adopted in July 1998, has clearly defined rape, sexual slavery, enforced prostitution, forced pregnancy, forced sterilization as war crimes and all crimes against humanity. And they're very much linked with the comfort women movement.
And it was really, I think a culmination of interrelating the case of the comfort women, of what happened to them during the Second World War, interrelating it to the different normative framework at the Commission on Human Rights, at the CSW, at the CEDAW, and eventually to the statutes of the International Criminal Court. And that was really a culmination of engraving and literally writing the legal responsibility and accountability of state parties that any forms of violence and sexual violence against women in wartime is a crime against humanity. It could be genocide and it could be a war crime.
So in this part, we would like to talk about the Women's International War Crimes Tribunal on Japan's military sexual slavery that we organized, and also address how the tribunal was norm setting in relation to the international movement to end gender-based violence. And we also do want to cover where we are now and how our movement and the tribunal relates to the current situations. So just as a refresher, I just want to give some facts of the organizing process that took place, and then Indai, you can really flesh out the spirit of it and the dynamism of it. So if you remember, there was an Asian Women's Solidarity Conference in April 1998 in Seoul, where the proposition to hold a public tribunal was presented. I think Yayori presented it from the perpetrator country. And support was established, and the decision to hold the tribunal was made then. And in February 1999, the International Organizing Committee for the Tribunal was formed at the preparatory conference in Korea. And the IOC, the International Organizing Committee, consisted of organizations and activists representing three parties, so victimized countries, represented by Yoon Chon-ok, who started this comfort women movement really, but based in Korea, who is a Rihwa University, Women's University professor, who really broke out the story in Hangul newspaper in 1989. And second component is Japan as the offending country, and the international community as a third component, which Indai, you represented. You were the co-convener.
Yeah.
So victimized countries included North and South Korea, China, Taiwan, the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Netherlands. And the International Advisory Committee for the Tribunal was established, represented by leading women human rights activist figures in the international women's human rights movement.
And I would like to mention their name because these are the women who supported us from different countries. So the members of the International Advisory Committee for the current war crimes was Ariane Brunet, from Canada. We had Charlotte Mans from the United States, Florence Botegua from Uganda, Tina Dolgopol from Australia, of course, Alda Facio from Costa Rica, Eugenia Pizza Lopez, who is both from Argentina and UK. And then we have Marie-May Haley Lucas, who was from France and Algeria. And then Lepam Lajenovic from Serbia and Vahida Nainar from India.
And in addition, a couple of international law experts who are renowned for their contribution to gender and comfort women issues acted as legal advisors to the tribunal.
Yeah.
And since that proposal was made, IOC met regularly in cities of organizing countries, including Tokyo, Seoul, Shanghai, Taipei, to discuss the rules and procedures, the statute of the tribunal, the charter of the tribunal, the participation of victims, selection of judges and experts in the tribunal, proceeding and funding activities. So the International Advisory Committee and legal advisors have met several times to advise on and to assist with the issues discussed at the IOC meetings. And every participating country has set up a preparatory committee to coordinate the participation of the tribunal. Research, evidence gathering, and documentation were undertaken at country level by victimized countries in coordination with research and investigation teams in Japan. They work together to look into war archives in the Japanese Imperial Military Army. And in addition, education and advocacy work was undertaken at both national and international levels to generate support for the comfort women issue, as well as the contemporary forms of violence against women in the context of the tribunal in every country, participating country. And so that's just a prelude. I just wanted, so can you please address how the tribunal was conceived and how the tribunal was organized?
Well, thank you, Miho, for expounding on the process of the tribunal. But I would like to add on to that because, the tribunal, when it was first organized, as you went through in 1998 during those conferences that we would have in Seoul, the materialization of the idea was there in 1998, but how to make it a tribunal went into a process. And I would like to link it because this was the time and the period that the establishment of the International Criminal Court was rolling within the United Nations. And I was already a part of the Women's Caucus for Gender Justice to the ICC in 97, 98. And during that period, the understanding of what the War Crimes Tribunal should be was very much into my system because I was attending the preparatory meetings in Rome as well as in New York. Then I told Yayori in one of our meetings in Geneva to talk about the tribunal at the Commission on Human Rights. And I said, if we are going to do this, we have to pattern the tribunal after the International Criminal Court, not just People's Tribunal, like the Bertrand Russell Tribunal, which was done in Belgium. I said, our tribunal has to be different. This has to be what a real, war crimes tribunal should be. And that is patterned after the International Criminal Court. And, Yayori immediately jumped into that idea. And that is when we started the whole process of identifying judges, identifying prosecutors. And then this is when all the victimized countries started to pull all their lawyers together to look at the prosecution in the context of the tribunal. But I think it should be investigated that our idea of the tribunal was simple from the start, which became much bigger than we thought. Because one, we have to draft the charter of the tribunal, and the charter is about laying out the rules and procedures like a legal court. The charter of the tribunal lays out the rules and procedures on how it will be run. Then the tribunal's prosecutors will have jurisdiction over the issues relating to the issue of sexual slavery and other forms of wartime sexual violence. Then the tribunal also has jurisdiction over both individuals and the states, and those identified responsible for the crimes, with emphasis on perpetrators in the high military and government position with command responsibility, including the emperor during that period. So we aim to clarify the charter that crimes committed before and during the Second World War. So and it was to prosecute the war criminals and to compensate the victims for the violence or for the crime committed against them. So it was really quite a process, I would say, because we are pushing for the responsibilities of the government of Japan to acknowledge the crime committed during the Second World War. Remember, we were going back to the establishment of the International Military Tribunal of the Far East that totally failed to recognize rape and sexual slavery during wartime. They were only looking at the crime committed, in terms of, massacres, but not sexual violence. So we were saying that the Women's International War Crimes Tribunal was an addendum to the International Military Tribunal of the Far East. This is a continuing, and this time we're prosecuting sexual slavery and sexual violence during wartime. So in this context that we decided to bring together, internationally well-known eminent persons and experts on international law to become judges, prosecutors, and expert witness. And, as I was saying, we have a movement with us that really supported the process. And so the chief prosecutors, which was, Patricia Vusur-Sellers and Tina Dolgopol, came together to write a general indictment, drawing from the indictments submitted by the prosecutors of the participating countries. Then, of course, the panel of judges consisted of world-renowned persons. They were legal experts and former judges. So we have the Chief Judge, Gabriel Kirk MacDonald, who was the president of the Yugoslavia War Crimes Tribunal. Then we have Willy Mutunga, who was the only man. He was from Africa and from Kenya, actually, and the head of the Commission on Human Rights in Kenya. Then we have Christine Chinkins, who was a professor of gender and international law at London School of Economics. And then we have, of course, Carmen Argibe, who was a judge of the Supreme Court in Argentina. We still have two other judges from Asia, one from India, Judge Bagwati, but he wasn't able to come because he actually got sick 2 days before taking his flight out of Geneva. And then another one from Thailand who couldn't also make it for other reasons. So with these 4 judges, we were able to set up the tribunal. Now, I would just like to say that the objective of the tribunal was to restore justice and dignity to the victims and to pressure the Japanese government to take responsibility for crimes committed during the Second World War. Then the other objective was simple: to promote women's human rights, including the understanding of women's human rights in the context of international law, and more importantly, to prevent sexual violence of crimes committed against women. And of course, thirdly, we hope that this tribunal will lay down the groundwork for reconciliation among the Asian countries with Japan for the Second World War. But that, of course, was our own hope. That aim should also come from the government of Japan. So I would say that the preparatory process for the tribunal was really remarkable because of all this, people coming together, and looking at how we can really influence the issue of the comfort women, not only through the legal system, but also to education, but also to influence international law and humanitarian law, and to look at humanitarian law from a feminist perspective, from the perspective of the women who were victims and not recognized by international law. And I think that was the major shift, because our demand was to rewrite history, to rewrite even international humanitarian law from a feminist perspective that acknowledges violence and crimes done to women during the war. Because, as you know, the international law is very static. It does not really define, the immensity that 80% or 80% of the victims of war and armed conflict are women and children. And even up to now, in the present day, 80% of the refugees are women and children, or internally displaced people because of conflict. So, we have much work to be done in this process. But as I was saying, there was solidarity in the preparation of the tribunal. That solidarity catapulted all the victimized countries to be united in one cause, and that was to prosecute Japan through the Women's Tribunal. Now, even if we acknowledge that the Women's Tribunal is organized by the NGOs, it does not have the legal authority to really prosecute the war criminals, because they were already prosecuted at the Military Tribunal of the Far East. But we are prosecuting them again for sexual slavery, rape, and mass rape during the Second World War. So the idea of prosecuting them again, because they were not prosecuted for sexual slavery, was a victory in itself, because we believe that it will be written into the history books. It will be written that since the Military Tribunal of the Far East failed, we are going to continue and address that failure, to correct that failure, to recognize crimes against women. And I think that is the most important part of it.
I hope, Indai, that you will document the tribunal so that you can capture and let the light that the Comfort Women survivors have given us and the light that we created run. And of course, it was no longer the perpetrator, the Japanese government, defining justice or denying justice, but it was the survivors and the activists who defined and realized justice, created justice.
Yeah, and I just hope that, in the years to come, we are still able to build that kind of movement that technically change, not only the normative framework in the United Nations to recognize women's rights as human rights, which has now evolved into gender equality and the empowerment of women, but during that time, I think we were more radical and in our approach, because it was not just gender equality, it was recognition of the violence and the crimes committed against women. and to recognize that, you know, the women's rights is the same rights as the men, you know, and that alone was, you know, it rattled, I would say, many of the governments to that women had the same rights as men. And I said, yeah, we do, you know. So it was a process, but we fought for it as a movement and we won.
I also want to talk about sacrifices that I have witnessed among Japanese activists who supported the comfort women justice struggles. My mentor and leader of one of the leaders of comfort women movement in Japan, feminist activist Yayoi Matsui. She was a former Asahi newspaper journalist. She was the first woman to be on the editorial board of Asahi newspaper. When she retired, she dedicated her life to feminist struggles, and she focused especially on the Japanese society and Japan's relation to women in Asia and around the world. And in the comfort women struggle, she was the co-convener of the Women's International War Crimes on Japan's military sexual slavery, together with Indai and Yunjanok. And after the tribunal, the tribunal judgment was delivered in 2001. And very quickly it became a very much right-wing environment across the world, I think, with Bush and Cheney coming on board in Japan around the tribunal, and soon after the tribunal we had ultra right-wing governments galvanizing a lot of right-wing forces. Yayoi started to get threats of letters sent to her home, and she at some point she had to stay at different places other than her apartment, so she was carrying her suitcase everywhere, but still every day advocating and coming onto events and speaking and very active. And she traveled to Afghanistan one day, and she discovered that she had acute cancer. So she passed away in December 2003, a couple of years after the tribunal judgment. And I'm sure all of the threats and the stress factors always cause illnesses. It wasn't just Yayoi, but there was Tatsue Takashima, for example, who was really leading the support for Filipina comfort women court case. She also developed acute leukemia, and she passed away a month after Yayoi passed away. So everyone, it's not just Japanese women. So many activists, I'm sure every activist who was in a leadership position in victimized countries, in Japan, they have sacrificed quite a lot of their parts of their lives. Everyone has family, everyone, carries important things, but this was a very demanding struggle. You had to really stand in the forefront of so many struggles up against Japanese government who continues to deny so there was a lot of sacrifice, but also tremendous gain.
So I think now it should be recognized how much the Women Caucus have really positioned itself at the World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna and shifted, the understanding and the normative framework that lead now to where we are in terms of the recognition on violence against women, gender-based violence, and other forms of normative framework that evolve, including women, peace, and security, and all of this. And I would just like to say that they all came out from the testimonies of the women, and more importantly, because there was really a movement of women coming together. Part of our feminism, as you mentioned, was really defining the process, defining what we want to achieve. because it is through the feminist approach that we were able to shift, the framing of humanitarian law and international law, because it was not recognized. Yeah, it was through that experience that we are saying, and there will be more feminists who will come out and say this, more survivors and more victims that will come out. Because when we look at where we are now, we are talking about the framework on women, peace, and security. Yeah, because that is where all the women, gravitates around the world when we're talking of the issue of sexual violence in situations of war or armed conflict. But what I would like to say is, in the framing of women, peace, and security, we have to recognize that there is a lot of loopholes in that. It does not address all the issues of, the situations of women in armed conflict, because we have limited ourselves. And now I'm a bit critical here, if you allow me, on the framing of women, peace, and security. Because one of the things that I have seen, and I have worked on this issue for these past years as well, is that there is a securitization approach on women, peace, and security. It has now looked at the framing from a military context. We need more women in the military. We need more women in the police force. It does not look at the security from a feminist perspective now. That security was about protection. Security was about protection of women in situations of conflict. But because women, peace, and security has been taken away by the government from the very movement of us, I was there in the first meeting on the drafting of the Women, Peace, and Security to the United Nations. The agenda there was to talk about women and what women go through during war and armed conflict. And to look at the security and the peace angle and how women should be involved in the peace process. I always tell the women, not all this peace process you have to be a part of. You have to politically analyze this peace process and find out what is their agenda. If their agenda does not construe women, you may as well pick up the peace process from the outside instead of sitting in the peace table. There are so many things that women can be engaged, and that does not necessarily be part of the process when the process is so male-dominated and refuse to acknowledge, the struggles and the position of women and the impact of the war on their lives and that of the children. So there are so many things there. So when one has to analyze women, peace, and security, you have to analyze, one, the context of women in situations of armed conflict, your expertise and knowledge in dealing sexual violence in conflict, and how to deal with women who are internally displaced, the IDPs, and the refugee women. And the different forms of gender-based violence they go through is separate from your expertise and knowledge on how to deal with the peace process. Because the peace process is very complicated. You have to be very political in order to be part of the peace process. You have to know the position of the rebel groups, you have to position the government, and you have to have your own position as women. You want to be part of the transitional government, you want to be part of the of the ongoing process from your position point of view. You have to do alliance work. All of these are very important. Do you have a critical mass base behind you to support you in this? So these are the things that you really have to work on. So, we need critical thinking here, as well as for the women. That peace process is about critical engagement. We have to be very critical in all this positioning and not just jump into this whole. If we need to reframe women, peace, and security, then let's reframe it within the feminist framework of engagement, but not just to jump into the flow, of the whole, United Nations framing of that, but to bring our agenda in a collective manner so that they will listen to us. So for me, we need to, bring that forth, because that is where we are now. But as I was saying again, build a movement for the women, build your own critical mass base to back you up when you want to talk about women, peace and security, but more importantly, strategically document all the violations done to women and men during the war and armed conflict, and to the children. Document them, because that is your strategic arm or bullet or whatever. That I wouldn't even say that. That is your strategic goal to bring these cases to court eventually.
Thank you, Indai. Ever more pertinent.
I know I should end it in saying, let's have hope. There is hope in this world. And for women, I think we have gained much more than we have thought, but we keep on moving forward because, the feminist approach is totally different. We have to make sure that our processes are heard, and we are fearless. We should continue just doing this, because it is through this process that we will be able to gain more mileage in the work that we do, more successes, and we're saving women's lives, and that is where it's most important.